So keeping in line with the topic of the police and police overreach in power, this is an article just 5 days ago, I think, published by Brian Carney in the Tai. That's how you pronounce it. But it's a pretty groundbreaking report on released internal documents by the RCMP. I don't know exactly how they managed to get their hands on this, but basically they detail a kind of what was meant to be a secretive internet surveillance program by the RCMP. The unit that was responsible for it is called the Tactical Internet Operations Support Unit. And it was called Project Wide Awake, which apparently is based off of a reference to a program, like a government program in the comic, like the X-Men comics, where the government was tracking down mutants, basically. So that's what they decided to name their, web monitoring program, as they call it, Project Wide Awake. It's pretty, anyone who already has skepticism towards the government in general, surveilling its citizens and their, web usage won't be very surprised by much of what was released here. But it basically shows that they're using programs to kind of, how would I say? They use programs to kind of go into people's data and exploit encrypted servers to try and, like, they're I don't know how to even describe it. Sorry. All right. So basically, the documents revealed the RCMP gained permission to hide sole source contracts for Project Wide Awake from the public through a national security exception, discussed three-tier covert operations involving the use of proxies, intermediary computers located elsewhere to hide RCMP involvement with spying activities, software with an aim to search the darknet, which I assume is referring to, like encrypted servers, dark web servers, which it defined to include private communications and those from political protests. We've had a few political protests over the last year, so one can only assume what movements they're trying to surveil. It's used a tool to unmask lists of friends on Facebook for users that specifically set friends' information to private on the platform. So they can access private information regardless of your privacy settings. They can just bypass all of that. And there was also a kind of, there seemed to be some controversy within the RCMP regarding the actual effectiveness of the program. The chief information officer complained that they were wasting resources, wasting time, and wasting money on IT projects. And then a month after this issue, he actually left the RCMP to work with Huawei, which raises all sorts of other concerns regarding Canadian national security, but that is a whole nother issue. And as I said before, took the names for Project Wide Awake and other internet surveillance programs from the X-Men comic book series. So at least we know they're humans and they like their comic books.
Yeah, this is something like America gets like the one of the biggest bad raps of this because like the Edward Snowden leak, but even there, I mean, like, everything, all this was just revealed to the public that like there's actually, especially particularly in the West, there's just like, it's just a fact of life that the government spy on almost everything you do or have the capabilities of doing that. And now this is just life. Nothing else happened. Just like the Panama Papers, right? They revealed that the wealthy were actually hiding and hoarding all of their wealth in offshore tax havens, and nothing has happened since, except the person that revealed it was murdered. But aside from that,
yeah, and there's a part of the article where they detail like how the RCMP has tried to justify all of this, private breaches, all this surveillance within the framework of the Canadian Constitution they said, oh, it's all, we're only monitoring open source activity. We're monitoring things that are, assumed that people post online on platforms that are assumed to be, public forums that anyone can see, when clearly that is not the case. They also had 3 different tiers for the levels of secrecy for what it is that they were trying to do. So tier 1 operations can be visible to the public. Tier 2 operations, described as low attribution, are for those for which it is considered not a serious problem if they're exposed. The exposure being kind of a problem in itself regarding our own privacy. Tier 3 operations are considered covert or undercover and involve separate clearance and clear RCMP identified, meaning identified with this activity.
Can we zoom in on that chart for a second?
They're clearly trying to hide what they're doing. We don't exactly know the extent of, what this program was used to monitor. One can only, they vaguely said, protests, criminals, biker gangs, the of, oh, we're using it just to, protect our communities and ensure the security of citizens. If they're so intent on hiding all of this information, one can only assume rationally, based on previous RCMP surveillance leaks, that there's a lot more to it, and that actually this is likely being used for political purposes. We can assume logically that they're using this to cover, private information of activists, likely in the defund the police movement, and likely Indigenous and First Nations activists, because the main clashes we've seen between the RCMP and Canadian citizens have been in clashes with First Nations, in the Wet'suwet'en territory at Lamback Lane.
Well, I think actually wasn't it revealed that the RCMP was, or CSIS, were actually spying on Wet'suwet'en protesters? And that's the thing as well. This is within their rational justification for it. We're trying to keep people safe by monitoring protesters.
Yes.
Oh God, that's terrifying and infuriating.
And the headline of this, "You have zero privacy," was taken from a leak of a conversation of actual members of this specific unit. Mm-hmm. Yeah, here we go. Other members were jokingly dismissive of public concerns about privacy violations. A training slide for the project says, "You have zero privacy anyway. Get over it."
Well,
it's so concerning. It's also when you compare kind of what is being revealed here to kind of what is the framing that you hear from the right, they say that surveillance is necessary to protect Canada from foreign threats and from threats of terrorism, but there seems to what's being shown here is that this is all much more internal, tracking much more on the grounds of political motivation, as opposed to any possible so-called foreign threats. So that's just very, very different from what we hear a lot when it comes to the topic of surveillance, and it's very concerning. And I want to know, where's the outrage from the so-called libertarian right? Where's the outrage? You can't be a libertarian and support this. You can't.
You'll often see, there's a reason why you'll often see, pro Second Amendment militias and libertarian groups brandishing both the Gadsden flag, the, don't tread on me, right next to the thin blue line flag. There's, it's because mostly what they aim to protect is just private power. And
you see that
they're not libertarians; they're nationalists.
And you see, like, I mean, they criticize Antifa so much, but recently, like the Trump protests in the United States, you see the groups of libertarians all wearing black and yellow. They're all very color coded. The same thing they say about Antifa, and then they're being protected by the police. And I know that that's in the United States, but it just goes to show, like, when it comes to like the so-called libertarians, it's antithetical to what libertarianism is. You can't be a libertarian and support authoritarian law enforcement and authoritarian surveillance. It's just antithetical.
I mean, to certain libertarian groups' credits, there are libertarian groups that have come in support of Black Lives Matter, and those groups have been basically exiled from the broader right-wing militia community in the United States in particular. Canada doesn't seem to have much of a, organized libertarian right movement, but in the United States, they certainly do. And, you have the Boogaloo Boys who like dress up in their sick military uniform. They've got all their, they've got their AR-15, they've got their floral shirt. So that's one thing that they use to distinguish themselves. And a lot of them have shown up to these protests in support of, defunding the police. And actually, some of the violence inflicted upon police has been from these groups, more so than, say, Antifa. Like there was one police officer killed in, I forget if it was Portland or Seattle, and they were shot by a libertarian Boogaloo Boy. That's what they call themselves, the Boogaloo Boys. And there are definitely, Nazis who have infiltrated their ranks without a doubt, and they're not very good at apprehending these Nazis and distinguishing themselves from them. Nazis or nationalists or, Trumpers, whoever. It's sometimes these groups tend to just kind of mix and meld. But to their credit, there are at least certain segments of libertarians in the United States who took a principled stance against, in support of, maybe not Black Lives Matter because they still think it's like a Marxist organization, but against the general objective of, limiting the power of the state and the police.
Mm-hmm. And also, I want to mention, I mean, for a long time in Canada, we talked about, the failure of the government to address the issue of the missing Indigenous women, and their failure to allocate proper resources to investigating that. But here we're seeing how much money and resources being allocated to the surveillance of our citizens, and it seems really, I mean, how many cases of attacks against Indigenous communities, such as what we were seeing on the East Coast, or that clearly these are not instances where there's surveillance and stopping this from happening. So I want to know, like, what exactly is this being used for? Because even by the wording that they use, it seems to be that it's supposed to prevent stuff like that, but yet it's unable to. So it calls into
another situation where law enforcement or people that are saying they protect everyone, they're just proving that they don't. They protect power. They're invested in power. They're invested in white supremacy, and they either don't care to put resources elsewhere. They don't care what happens to Indigenous people or Black people. They just don't care, and that's why their priorities are the way they are. And it's incriminating, but it's not surprising.
Surveillance isn't surveillance. The RCMP police forces and municipal police forces are all very more than willing to subvert actual constitutional law in order to protect private power, private property, in order to uphold, this system that we currently live in. They're more than willing to subvert, ethical norms of privacy, specifically on the internet, but
it's not
in physical time as well.
They're not even just norms. Privacy is actually an internationally recognized human right. It's in the Universal Declaration for Human Rights.
Speaking on things that are human rights that are also on this topic, I want to mention that the use of tear gas and rubber bullets also goes against the Geneva Convention. It's a violation of human rights, and in wartime it would be considered a war crime. Yet somehow it's an appropriate response against our own civilians exercising their right to protest.
If our police or intelligence services do it, it doesn't matter.
I know. That's one of the main things that really boggled my mind earlier this year. I mean, I know it's happened in the past, obviously, but when I learned that what you just said, basically, that just showed to me the extent to which racism is so encroaching and so powerful and entrenched in at least North America, of course, the rest of the world too, but is that we're using literal like weapons of war against protesters. It's just completely insane.
It's inhumane, and we've seen like so many examples of people who have been severely injured too, because I mean it's considered less than lethal, but how many people have lost eyes or have broken bones or faced serious head injuries because of the use of these weapons? It's insane, and we're seeing it here in Canada too, right? So
the main takeaway from this is that, any, violations of human rights, of privacy, of even, constitutional rights are all permissible under the framework of a liberal so-called democracy in order to maintain power structures within liberal democracy.